Could Ukrainian ballistic missiles be raining down on Moscow by the summer? Ukraine may have just built a missile NATO doesn't even have. And if that's true, Russia has a new problem, coming from directions it can't predict. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about range. Bigger numbers, bigger circles on the map, more confidence in a briefing room. That's the American way of thinking about missiles. Ukraine doesn't have that luxury. Ukraine needs range because Russia is enormous, and because every kilometer of distance is one more layer of survival for the pilot pulling the trigger. Now, something interesting is happening. A Ukrainian company called Firepoint, yes, of Flamingo fame, is developing what looks to be an air-launched ballistic missile. And if they pull this off, they're changing how the entire fight gets shaped in the air. Hey friends, Wes here, military veteran of two branches, law grad, and bad Russian speaker because mudro izuchat protivnika. And this comes from reporting highlighted by Dylan Malisyov at Defense Blog and others, where Firepoint's chief designer discussed adapting their FP9 missile into an air-launched system. The FP9 itself is already a serious piece of hardware. We're talking about a supersonic ballistic missile, roughly 850 kilometers of range, carrying an 800-kilogram warhead. Now that's from the ground. If you take that same missile and drop it from an aircraft already moving fast, already at altitude, well, you're no longer starting from zero. You're starting halfway through the physics problem. And that changes everything. Ground-launched ballistic missiles are dangerous. They're fast, they're hard to intercept, and they hit deep targets. But air-launched ballistic missiles do all of that with a running start. When a missile launches from a truck, it's fighting gravity, it's fighting drag, it's fighting inertia all at once. It burns fuel just to get into the fight. An air-launched missile skips that part. The aircraft has already climbed, it's already accelerated, it's already paid the energy bill. So now the missile can spend more of its fuel doing useful work. More range, heavier payload, higher terminal speed. Now the engineers can decide where to put that bonus. And none of those options are great news for Russia. Think of it like this: launching from the ground is like sprinting from a dead stop. Launching from an aircraft is like getting pushed down the track at full speed before you even start running. That free energy translates into hundreds of extra kilometers in many cases. And that means targets that were previously safe aren't anymore. Air bases, command nodes, logistics hubs, industrial sites deep inside Russia, all suddenly within reach without Ukrainian aircraft having to fly into the worst of Russia's air defense umbrella. What's that, Vlad? Are you scared? Oh, you're shaking. Poor thing. Calm down. You're shaking. Now here's where this gets really interesting. The real shift isn't just range, it's the geometry. Back when I was working on the E3 Sentry AWACS, you'll learn very quickly that tracking isn't just about where something is, it's about where it came from, where it's going, and whether your interceptors are positioned to do anything about it. Ground-launched missiles are somewhat predictable in that sense. They need launch sites, support vehicles, and terrain that supports the system. You can map likely launch areas and build your radar coverage around those assumptions. The threat is still dangerous, but it usually comes from a limited set of directions. Air-launched ballistic missiles break that model completely. The launch point is wherever the aircraft happens to be when it releases the weapon. That could be over western Ukraine, over the Black Sea, near NATO airspace, or approaching from an angle that ground-based launchers could never achieve. A Skybolt. That was the US GAM-87 AGM-48, a true air-launched ballistic missile from the early Cold War. In fact, those chaps over at the RAF expected to carry it on Vulcan bombers, and RAF material describes it as an American ALBM, air-launched ballistic missile with roughly a 1,000-mile reach, intended to let British bombers launch outside Soviet defenses. Now, it was canceled in 1962, which is one reason NATO never really built a lasting ALBM tradition. The closest recent US comparison is the Arrow, or the ARRW, the AGM-183 air-launched rapid response weapon. That was not a classic ballistic missile in the old Skybolt sense. It was a boost-glide hypersonic weapon launched from a bomber. Still, in practical terms, it sat in the same family of air-launched, very fast, hard-to-intercept deep strike weapon. The Air Force said in 2023 that Arrow would end after its remaining tests, and that there was no follow-on procurement planned. The closest operational NATO analog today is probably France's ASMPA-R, with one important asterisk: it's not ballistic. France's defense ministry and MBDA describe it as a renovated ASMPA air-to-surface strategic missile carried by Rafale on nuclear strike missions. France's own material contrasts its propulsion with rocket propulsion, which is a tell that this is a ramjet-powered standoff missile, not a ballistic one. So it fills a similar deep strike air-launched role, yet it gets there by a different path. Now, the future French ASN4G also belongs in the conversation, and again, with an asterisk, French defense material describes ASN4G as a futuristic, hypersonic nuclear missile for the Rafale F-5, and other French defense publications tie it to a scramjet-type propulsion concept. So, again, it looks more like a very fast air-launched missile than a classic ballistic missile. But what about Russia? Well, the clearest Russian equivalent is the Kh-47M2 Kinzhal, derived from the ground-launched Iskander-M. That makes it the closest match in concept to what Ukraine appears to be trying with this air-launched FP9. Take a ground-based ballistic missile family, adapt it for aircraft, gain range, flexibility, and uglier launch geometry for the defender. The old Soviet precedent is the Kh-15, known to NATO as the AS-16 Kickback. It was a much smaller Cold War-era air-launched ballistic missile carried by bombers, built for fast standoff attack and high-speed dives onto the target. Air-launched version of this will be fielded. The ground-launched FP9 is only just entering testing, and details about payload, performance, and integration remain limited or classified. So this is not an immediate battlefield change, but the direction is clear, because if Firepoint is even close to its stated timeline, Ukraine may soon, as early as this summer, possess a domestically produced ballistic missile with the raw reach to hold Moscow at risk. If Ukraine fields an air-launched ballistic missile, Russia is suddenly defending against a more complex mix of threats coming from more directions at different speeds and different altitudes. That stretches radar coverage, forces interceptors to be spread thinner, and increases the chance that something gets through. It also forces Russian planners to think differently about what is actually safe in the rear. Targets that once felt secure because of distance or geography start to look vulnerable again. Vulnerable. I have a problem saying the word vulnerable. My wife makes fun of me. I say it so you can hear the L. Vulnerable, not vulnerable. Anyways, there's also a bigger story here about Firepoint itself. They're not just working on strike systems, they're also exploring lower-cost air defense interceptors, which suggests they're thinking in terms of an integrated ecosystem, not just a single weapon. Firepoint, coming up with the Ukrainian version of a homegrown Patriot missile battery. That's exciting. So if Ukraine is going to build a sustainable defense industry that can stand on its own, this is exactly the company you'd expect to see leading that effort. In fact, if you were to ask me who is the Ukrainian version of Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, I would say Firepoint is in the top 3. So the takeaway here is simple. Ground-launched ballistic missiles are already a problem. Air-launched ones make that problem harder to predict for Russia, harder to defend against, and harder to survive. They don't just go farther, they show up from angles you weren't ready for, at speeds that leave very little time to react. And for Ukraine, that's the point. More reach, more flexibility, and more pressure on a Russian system that's already being stretched in multiple directions. That's it for today, my friends. Subscribing is cool, but you know what's better? Becoming a channel member. When you do that, you can support these videos directly, so I don't have to rely solely on daddy YouTube warbucks. If it comes down to me doing sponsored segments on my channel or channel memberships, I would rather do channel memberships. You guys get bombarded with ads enough as it is already. By the way, if you like your global security in written form, I do have a newsletter over at Substack. You can check that out right here. I write twice a week for free subscribers. Anyways, as we always say around these parts, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.